that you can tell people that they can go to the Harriman YouTube channel, and it'll be archived there. My name is Tanya Domi, and I'm a professor here at the Harriman Institute in the Balkan Studies program. Today is just another panel discussion that's very important to Harriman, but it's about our role within the academy on advancing not just research, but also new policy ideas. And today really is about policy with respect to conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, lessons learned from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues here that are participating. We will have somebody online. Basfia hasn't, I don't think she's joined us yet, but she will. Today we're going to be discussing a report that was published by New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. My colleague to my left here is Emily Prey, who's the director of the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in D.C., and she manages the gender portfolio. She has served as an advisor and contributed New Lines groundbreaking independent reports, including the Uyghur genocide and examination of China's breaches of the Genocide Convention, and an independent legal analysis of the Russian Federation breaches of the Genocide Convention and the duty to prevent. And that's how I met Emily, because I also contributed to that report. So I'm delighted to welcome you to the Harriman Institute. And she's going to open up by talking about the report. And then to my right is my dear friend, Vera Mjeku, who's actually a very experienced professional with more than 25 years in government, communications, community relations, human rights, and a graduate of NYU. She works at New York City Council, and she has become a very active advocate for the Kosovo survivors. She created and became co-created and was a leader with Basfia Goodman, who's going to join us on the Rally for Her Justice, a movement to raise awareness and to fight against the unpunished war crimes and crimes of sexual violence that occurred during the war in Kosovo in 1999. That's actually also how I met Vera, because I also participated in the Rally for Her Justice. And I want to really thank you for being here today, because I know it's really hard to get away from City Council at this time. Thank you so much. Absolutely. So I'm going to ask Emily to open up and tell you about the report. There are copies of the report. If anybody wants it, you can take one of those there. It's also available digitally. You can also go to the New Lines Institute website as well to get a copy of it. So over to you, Emily.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanya. Thanks for having us here and for having this event. Thanks everyone for coming. So our report, it was originally Tanya's idea, so all credit to Tanya. We wanted to look at conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, and there were a lot of parallels that we can draw from the situation in Ukraine and what happened in Bosnia in the 90s. And we wanted to look at what worked and what didn't, so that we can prepare Ukraine better to just support survivors, period, but more holistically support survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And that's a job that Ukraine has, but it's also its allies, the international community. And while we focused on Ukraine, the recommendations can be applied to other conflicts where conflict-related sexual violence is happening. Definitely, we found that sexual violence is consistently being used systematically as a method of war and as a method of genocide. And I want to highlight two groups of survivors of CRSV, just in my opening remarks, that aren't usually thought about a lot when we think about conflict-related sexual violence. And those are men and children born of wartime rape. And we talk about both of these groups in the report. So for this report, I was working with Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General, and the data that they've gathered and that they would send us shows that men are victims of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, especially Ukrainian soldiers who have been detained by Russian forces. The numbers are only increasing every month. And we saw this happen in Bosnia, especially when men were in detention. They were victims of sexual violence, they were raped, and they only started coming forward about 5 to 7 years ago to speak about their experiences. And one survivor from Bosnia said, speaking about his trauma, he said, "You carry it inside you like a bomb." And I think that that's very descriptive, and it just really shows the long-lasting effects and trauma that these experiences have, and that we really need to do better as the international community so that all survivors, men, women, boys, girls, people of diverse gender identities, feel like they can come forward and get help and receive justice, and they don't have to wait decades to do so. And then for children born of wartime rape, in Bosnia, it's estimated that 50,000 women were raped during the war. Obviously, the number is much higher, but those are the estimates that we have. And from that, 2,000 to 4,000 children were born from wartime sexual violence. And this was a critical component of the Serb campaign of genocide against Bosniak Muslim women. They set up rape camps, which some of you may be familiar with, where the whole purpose was to forcibly impregnate and occupy the wombs of Bosniak women so that they weren't able to carry the children of their own group, and they had to give birth to children of a different group. Children who are conceived from sexual violence in conflict, they face extensive social barriers, and sociocultural barriers to social inclusion, potential discrimination, legal hurdles for full representation. And again, like I said, it's, they're a group that people don't often think about in war, but when you have rape in war, this is something that's going to happen. We talked about it in the report again, but a positive situation that came out from Bosnia was that in July 2022 in Brčko district, they passed legislation giving legal recognition to children born of wartime sexual violence as victims of the war. And that means that they can have access to more support and services that they would need. In this past July 2023, the Federation Parliament extended services and benefits to all Bosnian victims of war, which now include these children. I say children, they're now adults, they're in their late 20s, early 30s. Bosnia is the first country in Europe to pass any kind of law like this. And it was done so by the advocacy of the victims, of the children, now adults themselves, who had no one to fight for them, no one to support them. And so they had to go out, they had to find each other, they had to do the grassroots organizing in order to create this change. And I think it's a really incredible example. It's something that we've been in touch with the Ukrainian parliament about, that a member of the Ukrainian parliament has said she's going to take this and move forward with this to start putting in place protections for Ukrainian children born of wartime sexual violence. And so it just shows how Bosnia is there's a lot of examples and situations that Ukraine can learn from. And we think it's so important that they start doing this now so that we're not waiting 30 plus years for victims and survivors to fight, to have recognition and the support they need. And our third co-author, Dr. Kinsey Spears, can't be with us today, I just want to give a little quote from her. She speaks a lot about practicing a feminist ethic of care, which focuses on social interconnectedness and collaboration of research. And she's said that as we were writing this report, we were thinking of ways to present real-time solutions that are survivor-centered, as opposed to just thinking about the international frameworks, how they work and their limitations. As researchers, we tried to practice an ethic of care, which included consulting with a number of international lawyers, NGOs, Ukrainians themselves, to ensure that we're using survivor-centered language and consistently thinking about how legal frameworks can work for Ukrainians instead of only being reflective of normative frameworks from the UN or from the West. And we began developing our paper at a feminist workshop on conflict-related sexual violence in Berlin that brought together academics, practitioners, lawyers, and civil society to share papers on how to address CRSV globally. And this was really helpful in shaping our ideas. And then just one last point is that the foreword of the report was written by Baroness Helena Kennedy. She's one of the top human rights lawyers and experts in the world. She's widely respected. And this really goes to show how transatlantic the support for Ukraine is and how much additional work across the Atlantic is needed to support these people who are fighting not just for their sovereignty, but also for their lives. And having different European and American bodies come together and work together on this report shows how valuable this research is, especially at a time when funding isn't necessarily given moving forward. So I'll finish my remarks for now.
Thank you, Emily. I just want to add that I was in Bosnia when the first decision was handed down by the International War Crimes Tribunal for Yugoslavia, and that decision was the Duško Tadić decision. It was the first conviction in that tribunal on sexual violence, and Duško Tadić was a Serb that controlled an area in northeast Bosnia, and he directed sexual violence between Bosniak men, which generally this is how it happens. They will actually direct one man to sexually assault another man. In this case, it's pretty grotesque. He directed that he bite the genitals off the other man. And so I just want to say that that was the first decision, and everybody needs to understand that Nuremberg had the authority and there was a drafted law to prosecute rape, but they chose not to. The Tokyo Tribunal did not prosecute rape. So the first rape convictions were yielded by the Yugoslav Tribunal and the Rwandan Tribunal, which is in the 90s, the first time in the history of civilization. I'm also going to address the fact that just in the past 2 weeks in Israel, many women were raped, and the Israeli authorities have notified the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. They have been taking photographs and videos of bodies that they have found that do yield to rape. So once again, another war, another iteration of this horrific crime. And that's why I think this report is so important, because the prosecution of these crimes is going to go well beyond Ukraine, and we can talk about it a little bit later. So now, Vera, I'd like you to open up. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
for being here.
Thank you for being here, and thank you, Professor Domi, for your relentless advocacy. We've shared many rally stages
yes,
and
we have.
congressional roundtables. So I'm glad to see you be a fighter and support so many.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to be talking about the survivors in Kosovo. It's a little bit different scenario. Although Bosnia and Kosovo were both parts of the former Yugoslavia, Kosovo was never its own state. So reporting and anything else was much more difficult. Almost 6 years ago, we started something called Rally for Her Justice here in the United States, a movement to raise awareness for the unpunished war crimes. We started working with the only survivor who actually spoke up. Her name is Vasvija Krasniqi-Goodman. I think she was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately, I don't think she can join us.
Yeah, we were just notified she can't be with us today.
Out of the 20,000 women, men, and children who were raped in Kosovo, she was the first one to come out and share her story. So she became a pillar of strength for so many, and she still continues to inspire so many women. Just some numbers: during the war in Kosovo, about 13,000 people were killed. Almost 1 million were expelled and displaced. 70,000 homes were destroyed. About 1,200 children were killed, and 20,000 men, women, and children were raped. At the end of the day, wars are remembered by the ultimate causes: brave soldiers, heroes, for whom families are proud. For those missing, their families fight on their behalf, and their names become synonymous with the cause. But when it comes to women and victims of sexual war crimes, there is a deafness. Not much is spoken due to stigma and shame, making it the most unrecognized crime. Violence against women and rape has added its own brand of shame to the aggressor, and Kosovo has been one of the most intrusive and traumatic stories. The harm inflicted has been an attack not only on the families but an attempt to impose extreme humiliation, devastation to a whole society. The Ukraine conflict has shown us that history does repeat itself, and if we don't draw lessons from the past, the same things will happen. It is always very painful to remember, and it's human nature to want to leave the past behind. But in order to prevent any kind of sexual war crimes, we need to speak up. We need to use platforms like these today. And any kind of talks, any kind of support for the survivors so that we can help to change the mindsets. We can challenge legal systems and political platforms and advocate and educate. During my recent trips to Kosovo, I've met hundreds of survivors. Most of them, they've not come out. I've seen the pain in their eyes, but also the hope and determination to never give up. In Mother Teresa's words, there is nothing more calming in difficult moments than knowing there is somebody out there fighting for you. Sexual war crimes, though, as Emily stated, are not only about women. They are human rights violations, and they require a very complex and collective response through advocacy and resolutions and sanctions and ultimate justice and prosecution. After the war in Kosovo, actually before that, we're proud that Tanya has also been part of this. We have been able to work with U.S. Congressman Colin Allred of Texas in introducing 2 congressional resolutions against sexual war crimes. In the case of Askia Krasniqi-Goodman, he represents her in her district in Texas, but also worldwide for all the survivors and to end this horrific crime. Soon there will be a Senate version of the resolution, and we hope that despite the challenges in American in foreign policy and domestic policy, we hope that the United States will raise and be an exemplary and driving force worldwide. Unfortunately, in the case of Askia Krasniqi-Goodman, after many court rulings, the perpetrators are still free, and the justice system has failed her and many others. The government of Serbia continues to neither acknowledge nor apologize the consequences of the war in Kosovo. There is no will into fighting for justice. There is no cooperation between the court systems of Serbia and Kosovo, and perpetrators are often glorified and protected. After the war, Kosovo itself went into hurdles of bad governance under the United Nations mission in Kosovo and the European Union, ULEX, where documentation of these cases went missing or they were even covered up. Yes. The lack of prosecution in Kosovo has long time legitimized the silence and the stigmatization of survivors. And throughout the years, the Kosovo society, which is still engaged into state building and has its own political challenges, has not prioritized survivors and their needs for justice. Survivors in Kosovo are not only fighting for justice, but there are hurdles in changing the timeframes for status recognition, help with supporting the narratives rather than relying on documentations and commissions, legitimize psychological and health support and the integration of the survivors into the workforce, civil society, and governance. Apart from government and politics, survivors and survivor groups, civic society is an essential building block that changes and can have a great impact. Schools and universities, just like this, advocacy groups and organizations play a crucial role in creating platforms and advocating, monitoring government policies, and also holding governments accountable. In a landmark verdict in July of 2021, the Pristina Basic Court of Kosovo sentenced the former Serb policeman Zoran Vukotic to 10 years in prison for committing rape and participating in the expulsion of ethnic Albanians from the town of Ushtri during the war. This was the first acquittal. After 2 decades of despair, hope for justice is finally returning for thousands of survivors. More than 1,300 women and men have now been granted the status of the wartime rape victim during the past 4 years, and they're now able to receive a monthly payment of about 230 euros. In 2023, the Kosovo Special Prosecutor Office has filed 4 new indictments in absentia for sexual violence. The importance of these cases is not only holding the perpetrators liable, but it's also giving other people more hope that there will be something happening with their cases. Kosovo is now finalizing a strategy for transitional justice, and progress has been made towards setting up a new war crimes research institute to gather classify information about the war. Just last week, I was so proud that under the leadership of Albania, the United States, United Kingdom, and Albania addressed a session on preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence with survivors from Bosnia, Ukraine, and Darfur. The president of Kosovo, Vjosa Osmani, spoke on behalf of the survivors. And only yesterday, President Osmani also spoke at the United Nations Security Council on the latest developments in the country. As an advocate, I was really proud to see where we've come. This was the first time that the president of Kosovo or any higher official had started their remarks with the survivors and how we should fight for them. So she only shared the story of the survivors, the stories of their resilience. And she shared that they have chosen not only to survive, but also to thrive, which is a message that she actually raised in whole to the Republic of Kosovo as a new government. I think change does start with everyone, and we all can do our part. You by being here, participating, us by doing what we do. Every voice matters and every story is important. So let's keep it up and let's all be engaged.
Thank you so much, Vera.
Thank you.
That's wonderful.
A quick comment.
Yes, please.
Just because one of the biggest barriers for accountability is stigma and shame, like social stigma and shame, because of the nature of the crime is viewed as private, and survivors and victims are often blamed for what was done to them. And one of the biggest things that can be done is having like political leaders, religious leaders speak out about it. So it's huge. The president of Kosovo talked about this, and I watched last week the session on CRSV at the UN Security Council, and I wish that more leaders and presidents, prime ministers would raise this issue, because it's something that happens across so many conflicts and across so many countries and situations, and that can be really helpful for then survivors feeling seen, feeling heard, and then they can come forward and give evidence and testimony, and that can lead to prosecutions or different types of accountability and justice.
I just want to add that President Yayaga, who was the first woman president of Kosovo, spoke at the Columbia World Leaders Forum several years ago, and she asked us that, well, she actually told us that she wanted to use that platform to discuss the conflict-related sexual violence in Kosovo. And I think that was the first time in particular, it happened at Columbia, but that speech, I think, was a groundbreaking speech. And that was during the period where there was a lot of efforts underway, including the skirt, the organized effort by Anna DeLilio, who was a professor at NYU, is no longer in New York, but she organized with an artist from Kosovo this skirt exhibition at the football pitch where all the women were raped by Serbs during the war. And I think that was really groundbreaking at that time. And let me also add that another initiative that's really important here is the Global Fund for Survivors. And actually Bosnia is like a country representative with the Global Fund. The Global Fund has sought to establish reparations as a basic human right for all survivors. And they're advising the General Assembly and the Secretary General. And I think their work also with the UK government is pretty significant. And I think we are beginning to see a shift on attitudes towards this crime and the stigma in and of itself. I would also add, from a transitional justice standpoint, there was a conference in Europe last year that I think we will begin seeing it because really the Ukraine situation, so many crimes. Isn't it over 70,000?
This one, I think it's over 100,000.
100,000 crimes. That you're going to begin seeing third-party states prosecute perpetrators because there's not enough capacity, even by the International Criminal Court, which has a limited mandate anyway. So what happened a year ago in Germany is that there was a prosecution of an ISIS fighter in Iraq who had kidnapped and repeatedly raped a Yazidi woman, and he was convicted by a German court last year. That's what I mean is an illustration of a third-party state. Any country that is a signatory to the Rome Treaty, which is the ICC, has the right to prosecute. And I do think there's expressed interest with regard to Ukraine. Over 36 signatories, I believe, to the Rome Treaty have indicated they were willing to help on prosecution of Ukraine crimes. So I think we're going to begin seeing this. I also know that Partners for Justice in London is beginning to represent Kosovars as well. They've been working with survivors to bring their cases up in third-party states. So this is good. It's definitely movement, and much credit to the Kosovar advocates because they really have been left out of the justice process. Any notion that there would be justice for the Kosovars has been more or less marginalized. And I think their voices are so important, and there must be progress on this issue. It just cannot stand. We're talking 20,000, which we know is probably underreported. And we know that not only affects families and the individuals, but without justice, you really cannot secure peace and security for the long term from a democratic standpoint. So with that, I just want to ask you, Emily, with regard to Ukraine, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of, at least from the report standpoint, and looking at Ukraine, hopefully post-war, and how to address these crimes?
I think so. We have about half of our report is policy recommendations for how to address the crimes. We have policy recommendations for the international community, for Ukraine, and for the United States split up. And I want to lay out some of our suggestions, and going off of the universal jurisdiction that you were just talking about.
Yes.
I think that's a really good option for the international community. They have a moral and a legal obligation to use universal jurisdiction to support Ukraine in its efforts to prosecute war criminals, alleged war criminals. And we again saw, there's the example with Germany and the Yazidis. We saw this being used on behalf of Bosnia. So in 2022, a court in Montenegro confirmed an indictment of Slobodan Krcic, who is a Bosnian Serb war criminal who raped several Bosniak women and girls in Foča during the war. And that, that's a successful example of how universal jurisdiction can be used to support a country who doesn't have the capacity to prosecute or look in, investigate all of the many war crimes that have been taking place. And there are several European countries, including Lithuania and Spain and many others, who have actually already opened up investigations into Russian war crimes in Ukraine. And more countries should follow suit. The Clooney Foundation for Justice, which was founded by Amal Clooney, it has a really good website. They launched their Justice Beyond Borders initiative, and that includes a global mapping tool that allows policymakers to check basically what kind of universal jurisdiction restrictions countries have for the genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. So in the last 30 years, only about 20 countries have used these laws to initiate cases. That's a pretty small number given the amount of war crimes that have been happening around the world and the many conflicts that we've had over the last 30 years. So using universal jurisdiction, I'm glad to see that it's happening in Ukraine. I would want to see it more. A survivor-centered approach is something that was really important to us to include as we were writing, but just as a general recommendation for anyone working on Ukraine, anyone working on any conflict. And that means coordinating with NGOs and civil society organizations on the ground. They have the trust and the buy-in of local communities already. They know their context best. You know, we were 3 authors and researchers from the West, and so that's why we consulted with a variety of different people and groups in writing this report. The most important thing you can do when you're working with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence is ask what they want. What does justice mean for them? What does accountability mean for them? And that's what the Global Survivors Fund reports that Tanya just mentioned look into. They have a report for Ukraine, they have a report for Bosnia. We cited both extensively in the report, and they worked with survivors. And you know, we know both of the authors of those reports, and it was a really amazing resource. And a survivor-centered approach has to be integrated into everything, into the International Register for Losses and Damages, in the domestic register that we also recommend, into any interim reparative measures, the humanitarian response, collecting and gathering data and testimonies for legal procedures, any Ukrainian state service providers and structures to ensure that our response to this issue and this crime, it's coming from within. It's not a global policy response to the situation. It's actually a coordinated response that has been worked out with survivors themselves. And the Women, Peace and Security agenda is also an incredibly important tool when we're thinking about any conflict and when we're thinking about the peace and security of any state. Essentially, the WPS agenda addresses the inequitable experiences that women have pre, during, and post-conflict, and talks about the importance of including women, especially women's meaningful participation in peace talks and negotiations. Research has consistently shown that when women are included meaningfully in peace talks, that peace is longer lasting, it's more sustainable. And when we're looking at Ukraine, survivors of conflict-related sexual violence should also be included in, when Ukraine wins this war, when there are peace talks, survivors and women must be included in any of these talks. And we can, again, like to Bosnia, where they had the Dayton agreement and where women were completely excluded, survivors were completely excluded to the detriment of the country. And the Dayton agreement's construction of multiple governments that were purposely decentralized has had the effect of weakening the overall state of Bosnia and undermining human rights throughout the country. And I really think that if women had been included in the 90s, if survivors of sexual violence had been included in these talks, then we wouldn't be seeing conflict brewing in the Western Balkans once again that we're seeing today. And so by excluding survivors from meaningful participation in those peace talks and ignoring the prevalence of rape and sexual violence and the gendered manner in which Serb forces waged their war, in which they waged their genocide, often using women's bodies as battlefields, the peace negotiators really missed a key opportunity to address some of the root causes of the war. And so when this war ends in Ukraine, there can't be complete justice and accountability until you address the root causes of the war. And so that's why the Women, Peace and Security agenda, I think, is an incredibly important tool. We have a lot of recommendations. I can't go through them all, but I'm happy to answer any more questions.
And during the time we were writing our report, the Biden administration did issue the first time the presidential memorandum on this crime. And so that'll be interesting to see how it gets implemented across the US government, and to bring all agencies to and their influence to bear with respect to this crime. And that was a good development to see. And again, I give the UK a lot of credit because they've been leading and we were following the UK without question. So with regard to Kosovo, you've been really active, Vera. You've been back and forth. You've been attending conferences. What do you see now that is perhaps different than it was, like 6 or 7 years ago? And where do you see the next steps going to address the injustice?
So I think there has been improvement in the judicial system. The prosecutor's office is pushing for more indictments. Only in 2023, we had 4 new cases, which is actually an amazing number compared to previous years. So I think the awareness campaigns and all these support from the survivor groups, also changing in legislation, they're working. Also going back to Emily's remarks, talking to the survivors, some of the things we were able to include in our resolution were the need for survivor centers. All they want, even that they have not come forward, and some of them are not planning to, they want survivor centers where they can all go and communicate with each other and maybe get services, psychological help and mental health. That's one thing they don't have, the survivors don't have in Kosovo. And that's one thing that they're fighting for. So although that it's kind of complicated, and I think Bosnia is the better version. In Kosovo, you have to appear in front of a commission, and although that 20 years have passed, you have to be examined by a doctor, and they have to finally approve the status. They're trying to do away with this. I think it's going to need changing in legislation and even more. They want to support also the narratives of the women and not only rely on documentation. Most of these houses were burned. They were running for their lives. So there were no social medias. There were no cell phones back in in the 90s. So a lot of the things that survivors do have today in Ukraine and anywhere else, the survivors, unfortunately, in Bosnia and Kosovo didn't have. So there has been some movement, and as you said, former President Yayaga, she now has a foundation. She's a voice for all the survivors, but also I think the current government, they are trying to see this as something that needs a solution. And I think it starts from within their government, the justice system, but also working closely with all the women survivor groups, providing more funding, getting these women involved more into government life and social societies, so that they can be involved and and they can have a say in what happens in Kosovo.
That's great. Thank you so much. I just want to add with regard to reparations in Bosnia, keep in mind, it's estimated 50,000 people were sexually assaulted. Only about 1,000 people are getting reparations. Many of those people that are survivors are impoverished because perhaps their husband was killed. They lost their property. It's like Vera said, people are running for their lives, same thing in Bosnia. And we're talking about people that may have chronic medical conditions and they don't have money to purchase the medicines that they need. This lifeline, 230 euros in Kosovo, goes a long way to help people lead a life of some quality, and especially if they're able to develop relationships with others, like in the survivor centers. So all of this has been recognized in Bosnia, but it still hasn't been fully implemented, and it's quite difficult to go through the process. And as a matter of fact, if you live in the Republika Srpska, at the end of this year, the opportunity for you to apply is ending. It's ending on December 31st. And more than likely, if you haven't filed, you're not going to get reparations at all, because the process is so lengthy and bureaucratic. This is a cautionary tale for Ukraine. This is the cautionary tale. And also, one of my big concerns, which we did include in the report, is that if there was a coerced peace agreement in Ukraine, we're bringing the parties to the table. And let's say, for example, if it were to happen right now, how much of the country would survive this in terms of its actual sovereign territory? The experience out of Bosnia demonstrates that if you live in a different area of the country, you do not get the same benefits that you might get in another part of the country. So in the RS, Republic of Srpska, when I say that, I mean the RS, the entity, the political entity of Republic of Srpska, then you get different benefits than you do in the Federation or in Vrčko. And that's a problem. That's a problem for the survivors. And it's a cautionary tale for Ukraine, because if Ukraine gets partitioned, and you just look at, how the war began with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, people could be left behind, and they will not get the same type of benefits, especially if they're partitioned out of Ukraine. And that's one of my major concerns about what happens to the survivors in Ukraine. So as an example, so I would like now to open it up to our audience.
Before we open it.
Oh,
up,
sure,
one
please.
more
Oh,
point.
I'm sorry.
As you
Please.
guys say things, and I just think
Yeah, of course.
Of course, sorry. So the importance of talking about like reparations and the fact that 230 euros or whatever it is, that can go a long way. One of the things that I worry about, not just for Ukraine, but just any conflict, there's such an emphasis on international legal justice measures. There's such an emphasis on, yes, we are gonna get Putin, we're gonna bring him to the ICC, like, that's never going to happen. I understand why it's said, I understand why people say it, but it's just not going to happen. And putting so much emphasis on international legal justice measures, I mean, just in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, there were only 32 convictions for crimes of sexual violence. And that there were more indictments, prosecutions, and but at the end of the day, only 32 individuals were convicted of crimes of sexual violence in the Bosnian War. And that's out of the 50,000, definitely much higher, but 50,000 women who were raped during the war. And that's not even including men, people of diverse gender identities. So, and that's been going on for decades. And I worry about the emphasis being put on that and the hopes of Ukrainians being put on that that's the only way to have justice. That's the only way to have accountability. I think it's important. I think it should definitely happen. But these types of processes are very costly. They're very lengthy.
Yes.
And there isn't actually a direct correlation between having, these legal processes and convictions and prosecutions and guarantees of non-repetition. And so that's why our report talks about all these other measures, all these other recommendations, including interim reparative measures, which are providing psychosocial support to survivors, providing medical care, housing support, free legal aid, all these other things that help them in the moment, because they need to provide food for their children. They need to buy, supplies for school. They need to buy clothes. They need to go to doctor's appointments. They're people living their everyday lives, and they need support to do that. I was just in Sarajevo a few weeks ago, and I was invited by one of our friends who's a prosecutor at the Office of the Prosecutor General in Bosnia to the Bosnian National Court to see sentencing of 4 war criminals from the Bosnian War. They were 4 Bosnian Serb police officers, including the chief of police. And I was sitting with all the victims and their families, and it was assumed that they would be convicted. It was in Bosnia and I didn't know what was happening, but I knew something bad had happened in the moment when everyone I was sitting with started yelling and crying. And my friend, who was the prosecutor afterwards, told me that 2 of them were acquitted, including the chief of police. And the reason that the judge gave is that even though all of these crimes were committed under his watch, tens of thousands of people displaced and violated in a variety of ways, there was just no way that he could have known. And so he was acquitted. And so these people have been waiting decades for their chance, for their day in court. And then it came and it went, and 2 of them just got let go. And And it's so, I'm getting worked up. It's very frustrating, and it's so devastating to watch this happen again and again in every war and every conflict. And that's why I really want to see, the work of the Global Survivors Fund and their reparations, right to reparations for conflict-related survivors of CRSV is really important. All the recommendations that we've laid out are very important.
Thank you, Emily. Yes, I mean, I do think that there's a time clock here that perpetrators are dying. It's been 30 years, and this would apply to Kosovo as well. So you're talking about people who have become older. They've been fugitives, perhaps. They are hiding. These processes take a long time, and for a survivor, every day they have to get up. And they live with that. And so their quality of life and all the recommendations we made would yield to a better quality of life. And that perhaps is a form of justice as well. And it should be seen in the context of a comprehensive approach for the survivors. So I want to open it up and ask anybody to ask, people can ask questions. And if you would identify yourself and your affiliation. Yes.
Hi, my name is Eli. I'm a master's student here at the Harriman Institute. I'm curious on, as it pertains to children who were conceived due to wartime rape, are the numbers of children or now adults in Bosnia claiming those reparation benefits similar to the 1,000 out of 50,000 female victims that you cited earlier? And then in Ukraine, has there been any intention expressed by the Ukrainian government to set up some kind of fund or initiative for the children who will be born in Ukraine?
I can take the children question in Bosnia. You want to take the Ukraine?
Second part.
Yeah. So about the children that were born of rape, they organized this NGO like probably within the last 10 years. The laws just passed in 21 and 22. They are very impressive. They are very smart. And I think there's a lot of agreement among the Bosnian population that they deserve to get these reparations. But the Federation Parliament hasn't spelled out specifically what benefits they will get, but they have asked to have housing help, access to education, and also access to jobs. And one of the impediments is that when you go in to file, you have to say, you have to indicate what the father's name is. And so that kind of thing, they don't know. And so then there's shame associated with that. And then people make deducements about the status of this young adult. So their start in life can be quite shaky. And that's why they're asking for the services that they're asking for. But that's just beginning in Bosnia. Just beginning.
I would imagine that the percentage would be less. I don't know if we can compare the numbers, but for Ukraine and children born of wartime rape, that's not something I've even really heard about or read about. There was an investigative podcast I listened to about getting abortion pills into Ukraine and into Poland, which is notoriously very anti-abortion, for the women refugees who had fled there. But beyond that, I haven't actually heard anything, but it's just the fact that we know it's going to happen. It's just, but because of the nature of its crime, it's not something that's covered or talked about. It's brushed to the side. And we want to make sure that these things aren't forgotten. And so right now, I don't know of anything that the Ukrainian government is doing, but I am talking with a member of parliament who said that she's going to start pushing this forward in parliament. I'm from a think tank. And so we, come from the policy angle. And so that's something that I've been highlighting in all of my meetings with policymakers. I was just briefing 30 members of various European parliaments 2 weeks ago, and it was something that I brought up, and that a member of the Dutch parliament said that he was going to look into. And so yeah, any conversation I'm having with Ukrainian government officials and Ukrainian parliamentarians, it's something that I'm bringing up and pushing as a recommendation for holistic support for survivors of CRSV.
Yeah, it's been estimated through an epidemiology process that approximately 4,000 children were born in Bosnia, but that's the only estimate I've seen. So they have to come forward and they have to identify themselves. Actually, Jasmila Zabanic, the great film director, has she actually produced a film called Gerbavica, which is about a young girl who finds out that her mother was raped during the Bosnian War. And when that was screened initially, that was in the early 2000s, over 7,000 people watched it, and it broke open the taboo of ever even talking about it. But to this day, men who've been sexually assaulted is a major, major taboo. And only a few men have come forward. So, yeah, as an example. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mary Tomai. I'm a master's student in political science, and I'm also Albanian American. That's why I'm here today. My question is specifically in regards to Kosovo, but it can also be generalized to any other conflict-ridden zone. Yesterday, when President of Kosovo Osmani was addressing the UN, she was talking about how we shouldn't fall into the trap of both sidism when talking about conflict, particularly in Kosovo and Serbia, but again, any other conflict region. I was wondering, what is your take on that whole both sides conversation when addressing conflict, and how would you say that directly relates to why addressing sexual violence hasn't been as successful as it should be in that context?
So I think I'll start
Yeah,
and then
you
you can
please.
continue.
Sure,
I think
sure.
also by attending the other UN Security Council session on conflict-related sexual violence, I think United Nations is very political, unfortunately, and when it comes to things like this, that's it shouldn't be both-sided, as she said. It should be, you should stand for the truth, and your country needs to stand for the truth. And I was glad to hear a lot of ambassadors, standing for the truth and stating that there was a lot done in their own countries and their own legislation. But unfortunately, when we talk about such a phenomenon worldwide and in institutions as the United Nations, which has not been very successful in a lot of its doings, unfortunately, it does exist. I mean, people take sides. They take sides with the war, and it's unfortunate. It's political. It's basically political.
I would just add on this issue of both sides is that the phenomenon that I know Vera's familiar with, and as is Emily, is genocide denial in the Balkans. And not only is it genocide denial, which is hurtful to any survivor of a sexual assault or any crime that took place during the war, is a celebration of the perpetrators who actually carried out crimes, which is referred to now as triumphalism. And so this is a phenomenon that is very ugly, because we have international courts that have issued these landmark decisions with respect to Srebrenica, which was determined to be a genocide. And I might add, which is never discussed, that the women in Srebrenica were taken to the White House during the genocide, the commission of genocide, and they were raped. Now, those charges were severed from the Krstić prosecution, General Krstić, but they were prosecuted and they were found guilty of rape, but that's never discussed. Nonetheless, I would say that this phenomenon is carried out by Croatia. When war criminals return from jail, they are celebrated. And this both sidism is reflected on some sides in a very ugly way, and they will not acknowledge, as Vera mentioned, they will not acknowledge these crimes took place, and they actually deny that they take place. And one of my questions that I have, it's like a rhetorical question, but I have been told that there are people that have been beginning to question just how many rapists are there in Serbia, and that how many people that live in Serbia think about that, because it is a fact. It is a fact, and it's really disturbing to see them to continue this denial and their refusal to take accountability. In the case of Mr. Vučić, he was in the Milosevic government at the time of the war. He was the spokesperson for that government, but other people in the Serbian government weren't in the government at that time. So there's this resistance to apologize. There's this resistance to take responsibility. And in that vein, I just think that says everything you need to know about them as a society. It's very, very, it's very troubling. And then what that does to all Serbs who had nothing to do, perhaps nothing to do with the war, all of them bear the responsibility for these crimes because their leadership refused to take responsibility.
And then, oh,
Please.
I'm gonna add on
Please, yeah.
just quickly. One of our recommendations is that Ukrainian perpetrators of war crimes against their own people and against those aligned with Russian forces should be dealt with and prosecuted just as seriously as Russian war crimes against Ukrainians. And I think that's not like a very popular thing to say in a lot of places, but you can't, when it comes to these types of crimes, and especially crimes of sexual violence, you can't be political. Like if justice isn't for everyone, then it's for no one. And in my meetings with policymakers that I've had so far on this report, it's actually been really encouraging because everyone that I've met with has been very interested in the report, in the findings, and to know what they can do. And just the fact that no one else is talking about this. In the very beginning of the war, there was a lot of media in the first few months about rape and sexual violence.
Yeah.
And that was due to the ombudsman of Ukraine. There was some drama with that and she got fired, but she maybe was making things up. But there's been nothing since then in the media. It's been like kind of silence. And so it has been encouraging to hear that this is being taken seriously and that people want to know more and they want to know like what they can do to help us.
Thank you. Stephanie Greco is at the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. I have 3 questions, and it's because I worked in the former Yugoslavia and I was in Kosovo for 2 years, from 2000 to 2002. My first question about mental health in general, Tanya said Hrvatska opened up the taboo in Bosnia about what had happened to people in Kosovo when I was there. Mental health in general was not something that one ever discussed, ever. It was just people were locked away in their homes. It was a shame what people suffered. Has that changed at all in Kosovo? Because to have a center for survivors would be wonderful. But I'm thinking about mental health overall. Is it more okay to talk about mental health now in Kosovo? I haven't been there in over 20 years. I don't know. My next question is for Tanya, the fugitives. I've been living here in this country from the former Yugoslavia, about 300. For sure there are rapists among them. And I'm just wondering about them. And who's looking into them anymore? I haven't heard anything in 5 or 6 years about that. And then my final question about Ukraine. So we all know, unfortunately, sometimes international missions don't always have all the best people with best intentions going in. What sort of trainings will be available to people, for people, just regular people like me who went in? I was not qualified to talk to survivors, but for sure they will come to you because it's okay to tell a foreigner they're an outsider. But then there are people who will go in with bad intentions, who will further traumatize the people that they are charged with working on behalf of. So I'm just wondering, thinking a little bit about what sort of training will go into all of this huge mission that will probably go into Ukraine at some point.
So I'll start with Kosovo. There's been a deafening silence till Vaskia Krasniqi-Goodman came out and spoke and shared her story. It was immensely painful to hear her share details, and I'm sure most of the people that watched her at home, it was a very traumatizing experience. The Kosovar and also the Bosnian societies are characterized by a lot of shamefulness and stigma, and this is something that the survivors have to deal with, and their families. As Vaskia always says that if it wasn't for her family supporting her, she would have never come out. Unfortunately, that's not the case for other survivors who are ready to come out, but they do not have the support of their families. This goes to say that the society in general, I don't think is ready to accept, unfortunately. But whatever we're doing, whatever the survivor centers are doing, by talking about it, by sharing the experiences, by dealing more with introducing laws, I think it helps bring the stigma down, and it helps making this an agenda that everybody should talk about, and making this something that the government should focus on. I think it's also important to include this into the educational system, where children in school should hear about them. It's not only history, but there's much more than that. And I think there is a movement. I think especially the 4 or 5 last years, there's a substantial movement, but it will take time. I mean, if we talk about 20,000 survivors, and only actually 2 people have spoken out. Also, Shreda has spoken out, but unfortunately, she doesn't have the support of her family, so she is on her own. It talks a lot. It talks about that we need to continue what we're doing, and hopefully the stigma and the shame will come down, and more people will come out and speak out.
So with respect to deportation of people, there was a deportation this year. And those deportations for illegal entry because they committed a war crime is done by Homeland Security now. It's not in the State Department anymore. And there was a person that was deported in January. An Ohio man was found to be in violation of our entry requirements, and he had covered up his role in a war crime and had been in the Serb army of the Krajina during the period of time where they were ethnically cleansing Serbs from the Krajina. So that just happened. So it continues. It does continue. I've seen other deportations too, but I just did a quick check, and Homeland Security is responsible for that. There's a lot to do, but it does seem. I actually was involved in identifying. I was involved with an NGO that actually identified a perpetrator in Atlanta, and he was deported as well for committing crimes in Bosnia. So it does continue. I just don't think we hear about it that much. It doesn't get a lot of headlines.
And for your last question, the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine has been working on trainings to provide to investigators and those gathering data and testimony. This is another barrier for accountability, is that there are so many different disparate, disconnected efforts in Ukraine where everyone has good intentions, but they're not necessarily coordinating. They might not know that others exist. There's big, like multilateral international ones, there's more smaller ones. So I'm sure that a lot of ill-informed or maybe not the best equipped people are slipping through the cracks, which is unfortunate because if you're not properly trained, then you can re-traumatize survivors. And it's also, there's the potential for secondary trauma where people who are recording testimonies
Right.
and gathering data, when they're hearing these horrific things again and again and again, like you can, it affects you, obviously. There's also one of our recommendations is about the framework of cooperation, and this was a framework that was between the government of Ukraine and the UN's Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Carmela Patton. So this framework was signed in May 2022, and it brings together international and national actors to support survivors of CRSV. This also includes trauma-informed and gender-sensitive training. So they are doing a lot of really great work already. And that's definitely, like, people are aware that that's an issue and they're working on it, but I'm sure that that's not necessarily across the board. And then sort of related to the fugitive question, that was a recommendation we have for the US, is because right now, the United States doesn't have a statute criminalizing crimes against humanity. So we are essentially a safe haven for perpetrators of crimes against humanity. They can come here and we cannot prosecute them, which is crazy. And Congress needs to pass a bill on that ASAP. And I didn't actually know about that until we were doing the research for this report, because it's something that you just kind of assume. But that is, yeah, we can dispute genocide, we can dispute war crimes, but we don't have a statute criminalizing crimes against humanity. And so I'm sure that that helps, you know, people who are
Also in Kosovo, in
crimes.
the latest resolution, that one of the recommendations that is included in the resolution is for the United States to help Kosovo with sensitive training of law enforcement officers as well as medical staff that do work with the survivors. So they've seen that, the survivor centers, they've seen that as a problem, and that is one of the things that we're hoping that this rehabilitation center will also entail.
So the office that we were working with in the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine, they have a special unit dedicated to crimes of sexual violence. It's led by an incredible woman, Irina Didenko, but her team is only 8 investigators. And so as of last month, they had 236 documented crimes of sexual violence. Again, obviously there's much more. This is just what is documented by their team. And it's just also a capacity issue, all of this. There's just not enough qualified, trained people to work on this for survivors.
But the BiH War Crimes Court has a witness office for witnesses, and the person who runs that office is a psychologist. And what they've demonstrated in Bosnia, if a survivor is going to testify, she's going to have to go through a lot of psychotherapy through the preparation period, and then in the follow-up after the trial. So that is one of the comprehensive ways that people have to be cared for and supported as they go through the transitional justice process. And, you know, for example, there is an NGO in Bosnia called Medica Zenica, and the woman who runs that founded it. She was displaced during the war herself. She's a psychoanalyst and runs that center and has been running it since the war broke out. And those services continue. So what we see is not only do you have to have support during a transitional justice where you're going to testify, but for the rest of these people's lives, they require services and support. It never leaves them, ever. That's what's really important to remember.
And just to also emphasize that although the war ended in the 90s, it's, you know, tensions are still very much ongoing. And the founder of Medica Zenica, it's based in Republika Srpska,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Which is Serb majority in Bosnia. And she's actually, like, local politicians are trying to imprison her based on fake, like,
There's a new NGO law that Milorad Dodik passed and it's working against NGOs right now. They're like, they're auditing a lot of NGOs.
And it's to silence
Yeah.
people,
Yeah,
basically,
yeah.
people who are promoting women's rights,
Mhm.
people who are promoting human rights,
Mhm.
people who are working for survivors of sexual violence. So even 30 years later, they're still being silenced. Their lives and livelihoods are being threatened. So it doesn't end when the war ends.
So the Council of Europe Commissioner on Human Rights, Tanya Domi, who is a Bosnian citizen, she's aware of this and she's looking into it. So that's good. That's good. She has been very effective in her role. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about the experience of men who had conflict-related sexual violence enacted upon them in Bosnia and in Kosovo. If there are like observed cycle of violence effects where these men then perpetrate more sexual violence afterwards, or if that's not something that you come across in your study.
I've not heard of anybody that has done that.
Yeah.
I've not heard of that at all. It's an interesting question, but yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard in Kosovo either. And in Kosovo, the number of the men is really small, so.
Yeah.
And it's there's not much data, they're very close cases, so we don't hear a lot about them.
Mm-mm. I do know that men, through Medica Zenica, they've been helping them file for reparations. And these men have approached her NGO and they've helped a lot of men, but I've never heard of any man who was a victim who perpetrated against somebody else. Fortunately. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. This is a very important topic, and it's real, and it just happened 2 weeks ago in Israel, and it's just it just doesn't leave us. And now I do think I will give credit to Merrick Garland. He did go to a meeting in Ukraine in March. There was a readout on it, didn't get a lot of attention, but he has indicated that the Department of Justice is committed to prosecuting war crimes on Ukraine. So that's good to hear. And with all the other signatories and the ICC agree. Yeah. So this is a good development. We'll have to see, but it's a new day, and I think the victims now, the survivors, are really working hard in different places, and the Global Fund has really given so much visibility to the needs. So thank you for coming very much. We appreciate it. I want to thank Carol and Emily as well. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see what your husband came in. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. If anybody wants one of these, please, you can pick it up from the table there. Yes. Yes. She does it.